I'm talking to Julie Bayl, who's just finished writing a book called Focus on Survival, Young Families Struggle to Survive World War II. Now Julie, the book is actually based on the story of your husband's family.
That's right, that's correct.
So it's, in theory, it's not a fiction book, but it's a non-fiction book. But
That's
it's
right.
based on that story.
Yes, so it's what we would call a historical drama.
Right.
Based on the facts.
And he told you the story at some stage, or did you speak to them? Or?
No, well, my husband's mother and I started talking when I first became part of the family, and she was telling me things that happened to them during the war, and I was very interested because I've always loved history and I loved learning about things that have happened in the past. So I kept asking questions and kept getting answers, and I kept saying to her, we should write this down.
Yep.
Someone should write it in the family and have it for posterity. And she said, well, I think so too. But no one in the family was interested, so eventually I got to that stage.
Fell to the daughter-in-law.
And I said to her, would you mind if I write it? And she said, no, I'd love you to. So that's what happened. I started taking notes after that.
So it's basically, it's a sort of a verbal history, isn't it? To some extent,
it has been, yes.
Now, your husband's mum and dad, they were in Germany?
No, they were in Holland.
Oh, in Holland, okay, when Germany took over.
Yes,
Holland,
it was occupied by the Nazis in May 1940.
And what did he do for a job?
Well, my father-in-law was a photographer. He was a professional photographer, and his family were a whole line of photographers. In fact, his great-grandfather was the father of photography in Holland.
In Holland, yep.
And so that he and all of the family had shops and businesses all over Holland. And so that was his livelihood, which stood him very well in stead later on.
Later on. Was he Jewish?
No, he wasn't. He was, I think, if you go back to the great-grandfather, he was actually from Germany originally. Right.
So he's in Holland and the Germans invade.
Yes.
And then he's sort of stuck with his wife and did they have the two children before the war or during the war?
Well, one child was 2 years old when the war started, and the other one was just born in December 1939, so just after
it started, yeah.
That was my husband. He was younger of the two. And then during that 5-year period, his mother had 2 more children. Well, one was born 3 weeks after the war ended, but one was born in the middle of the war, a brother, and another little sister at the end of the war.
And they've all survived?
Yes. Well, they're not today, but, they did survive
the war. Now, 2 of the children were haemophiliacs.
That's right. That was my husband and the brother that was born in the middle of the war.
Now that's bleeding, isn't it? That's the...
Yes, it's a blood disease, and it's due to a chromosomal defect, and it's passed on from the mothers to the sons.
Yep.
And it's pretty awful. And
that's where staunching bleeding is a real headache, isn't it?
Well, it's not external bleeding, but it's the internal bleeding. Really
undercover bruising type stuff.
And as the story brings out quite clearly, there's quite a lot of information about what a devastating disease that is, although it's not the focus of the book, but it is an interesting side issue they had to cope with.
So he's in Holland and the Germans invade, and so was he able to still operate as a photographer and so forth, or did he have to sort of change professions?
Well, he tried to keep going. He had brought his business from a shop to his home and worked from home.
Yep.
He did have some work, and possibly some of it would have been from the German occupiers sending photos home, but he wasn't making a lot of money. Nobody was really, except the people that were really working hand in glove with the Nazis, and they became known as NS-Bayers, which just means
collaborators.
Yeah, collaborators. And so they had good businesses, but most of the other people had either shut up shop or not hardly have any money.
How could they survive if...
very, very difficult.
Very difficult, yeah. Now, I notice you say the story is sort of love, hate, war, peace, joy and survival. Now, I don't know of a book that doesn't cover all of those, or that covers all of those things in one in one volume. So
it's quite interesting how it does. Actually.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So after the two children were born during the war, that would have been terribly difficult to get any treatment.
Very. There's one section of the book which I devote to when my husband was a little boy and he almost died with a bleeding episode, and what they did and how they coped, and it was very hard because the only medication you could get was Bex powders.
Right, a cup of tea of Bex and
which
lie down.
Yeah, which didn't do too much to pain, that the type of pain that people with haemophilia have.
Yeah.
But it was the only thing available, and plus my mother-in-law used a lot of naturopathic remedies that her mother had used on her brother who had haemophilia.
Right.
And they helped, but none of them actually, well, they don't have...
It doesn't cure, but
no, there was
makes
very
it a bit more
little you
manageable.
could do, to compared to what can be done today to help.
Of course. Not that it's any. I suppose it's more treated now, but it still doesn't make it.
It's still awful.
Awful. That's right. Yeah, that's awful. So there, and then they must have decided, or the father must have decided, Ben, I presume is the father's name, must have decided then to still help the resistance.
That's right, because Mum had not been aware of it, but he started secretly going to their meetings because he was so against the Jewish people being persecuted and taken off and executed. And that really, he was a man who had a real sense of justice, and he really was upset about what was going on.
Really, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. And because he was a good photographer, in the end he decided he would offer his services because they needed someone to forge passports, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
It would be back in those days too. Nowadays
now
with
it would not be hard.
It'd be dead simple. Yep.
But it was very difficult because it was all done with a magnifying glass and a very fine pointed nib, and it was dot 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 dot.
Yep.
So and it was hours of painstaking work.
Just for each photo. Yep.
Yeah, but because he was a professional photographer, he had learned how to correct damaged photos and patch them up so you couldn't even tell that anything had been ruined
done
on
to
it.
them, yep.
And that's part of the same process of forging, and so they realised he could do it. He already could do it.
Yep.
And so when he made his services available, he was very, very much appreciated because he took the photos as well as made up the new identities.
So this was still some of the Jewish people to escape or to be no longer Jewish in German eyes.
Yeah, yes, and to give them a new name and whatever. So it was very, it was risky, but he wasn't going out on the front lines with the resistance
shooting
fighting.
people, blowing things up.
But he realised that it was very essential, and it was the way he could contribute. And
at some stage he also masquerades as a midwife. Now, how does a photographer become a midwife?
Yeah, very interesting. This is one of the fascinating parts of the story, actually. Well, my mother-in-law was a midwife, and she was, of course, fully qualified, and so because she was a midwife, she was able to keep her bike, which was an essential service for her to have.
To travel around
and the bike and Dad in the disguise were able to get rid of the passports, and also he could go looking for food, and it was very much safer because first of all the Nazis were watching him, and then you'll read about that in the book why they were. He was under suspicion because he was a photographer for a start.
Yep. And
secondly, they actually did incarcerate him for a couple of weeks and try and get the truth out of him, but they didn't.
So he was subject to torture, or?
Yes, but after 2 weeks they didn't have any concrete evidence, so they had to let him go, but he certainly got beaten up, yes. So his masquerade was very helpful.
Yep, and so I suppose having been in the Nazi prison, he'd be wondering what his fate were. Even that 2 weeks must have been absolutely hell.
It was.
For him and the family.
Yes, and for my mother-in-law, of course, with little children, she was terrified because she thought he might never come home.
Well.
Because he'd never told her in the beginning what he was up to, but after that she guessed, of course, that there was more to it than just being a photographer. But yes, Mum said I had him either dead and buried or in one of the concentration camps.
Or somewhere, but not here. basically. Now, towards the end of the war, they did manage to escape, did they?
No, well, he never ever was caught by the Nazis, even though they raided their home many times, but he had a really good hiding place. And Mum was really very brave too, because she was able to hold the fort and convince them in the way she spoke to them that perhaps she was left on her own with children and that he'd left her. That was her reason for him not being there.
Her get out,
Yeah. And Mum was a very honest person, but she said, I realised his life depended on it, so she was willing to, of course...
Tell a bit of a fib?
Yeah, bend the rules.
But that's, I mean, that's saving life. That's,
of course, it was,
it was
warranted.
You couldn't call the lie, could you? No.
No.
And so towards the end of the war, what happened then?
Well, by the end of the war, they were literally physically starving, and she was well pregnant with the second pregnancy, and they were getting very weak, especially Mum, having had 2 children as well, plus 2 before. And she actually then, because it was so dangerous for men to be seen, because a man would be just walking down the street and he'd be just nabbed and that was it. You never saw him again, because they grabbed every person they could get in the end, because they were so desperate for manpower. And so in the end she said to Dad, I'm going to ride to Zwolle and I'm going to get food from an uncle who lived there. Now that Zwolle is probably about 50, 60 kilometres away, or maybe even further than that. But the thing is, she had to ride by bike, and you know, you're in the middle of a war, and she was pregnant, but she was willing to do it, and she almost got wiped out at the coming home from that trip, because the bridge she was crossing was bombed by the Germans, and it was hit.
And she managed to get over?
Well, she got injured, but she didn't get killed. But it really is quite interesting.
Did she have the food?
She had the food, and the food was splattered all over the place, as you can imagine, when she came off the bike.
Been so desperate to pick it up and get it home.
And
Isn't it amazing, some of these stories which we're finding out more recently, how do people ever manage to get through?
Well, that's the remarkable thing. That's why I think the book is such an inspiring book. And it really shows something like my husband has always said. We're a bit like tea baggers. We don't know our strength till we're in hot water.
That's exactly right.
And his parents certainly showed their strength when things were against them. And they just demonstrate that the human spirit is amazing. You know, that people, if they have that hope and that desire to try and not give up.
If there is a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, they can keep going and they can come through.
Absolutely amazing. So, after the war, I'm presuming they came to Australia. Well,
that was one of the reasons why. My father-in-law said, I don't want to stay here for another war. We've had 2 wars in Europe and we've been right in the middle of it, because both times Holland was occupied by the enemy. And he said, we're getting out and we're going somewhere where we will be safer.
Right, so they came to Australia as displaced people? Or?
No, they waited. Well, they couldn't do anything during the war anyway, but in 1953 they came out. And they settled in Marmont Point, actually. It's on Lake Macquarie, just near Newcastle. And they loved it, and that's where they lived until, well, my husband and I, we lived there for a few years up that way too, and then we moved to Cowra, but his family all emanated in Australia from Newcastle.
From that area. And did he take up photography again, or continue his photography?
No, he took up photography again.
Yep.
Yes, and he had his own shop in Toronto, which is nearby. And he was a very clever man and a real character too. And you can see that in the book. Funny sense of humour.
So now this book, when is it going to be released or launched?
Right. Well, it's actually been published now, and the launch will be on Saturday, the 16th of September at the Japanese Gardens at 3 o'clock.
At 3 o'clock,
Anyone who would like to come along would be very welcome. And I will have books for sale if they're interested in purchasing one, or else they can get them on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
And how much are the books?
The soft cover is $29.99, hardcover $49.99, and it's also available as an e-book for $3.99.
That's incredible. Isn't it funny how they all end in 99?
I know, it's ridiculous.
Well, thank you for sharing that story with me. That is absolutely fantastic.
I think it is.
It is a good story, and we wish you well with something, and hope a lot of people buy it and read it.
I'm sure
and
they'll
realise
enjoy
just
it.
how brave that couple and their little kids were.
It's really a lovely story, and I think that was the whole thing. I always felt it had to be told.
Yep.
And that generation's passed away, and even our generation, like my husband's generation, is getting old.
Yep.
And in another few years, no one would know that story if it wasn't written down.
Oral history is so important, isn't it? And now we can record it.
That's right.
And it's there forever.
It is, and it's really heartwarming, and it's inspiring to others.
Yes,
because we don't
exactly.
know what sort of things we have to face in the future either.
No, unfortunately. That's true. Well, thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you very much for letting me.